Hi everyone, we're so glad you've joined us here at Center for Brain Health for Sips in Science. Let's get started with a brief video underscoring the importance of brain health for you and for society. After that, we'll introduce our speaker.
We work, we live, we innovate and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
So how do you boost brain power? Welcome to the BrainHealth Project, an urgent call to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
This is an absolute crisis, as great as any we have ever faced. We have to equip the minds and brains of our citizens to cope with the accelerating, dizzying rate of change that they face in their lives.
Your brain health is not fixed. Scientific discoveries prove it can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point.
Our greatest value, the asset that will help us to change everything, every problem we're in, is all in our head.
To harness that treasure, we must measure and monitor progress while things are going well versus waiting for an injury or disease to strike.
Too many of us are outliving our brains, and that does not have to be the case.
The information age is bombarding us with more content than our human brains can handle. How do you keep from getting lost in this and focus on deep thinking? For starters, stop multitasking.
Science shows us that multitasking is bad for your brain. It reduces fluid intelligence, causes brain atrophy, and increases chronic stress.
The global pandemic is creating more stress than ever, stress that leads to depression and anxiety and beyond. Unlocking our potential to navigate these hurdles starts with learning the right strategies, even in school.
So when teachers have these strategies, they're empowered to support our learners, and then the learners are now able to take ownership of their learning.
Training kids how to think is doubling academic achievement among middle schoolers.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Our world-renowned scientists know you can increase your brain health, not lose it. It's time for a new category of health. Brain health. You are a game changer. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Welcome everybody. Wow, I always get inspired looking at that intro video. So welcome to the Center for Brain Health and our September version of Sips in Science. And we're so excited tonight to have Dr. Francesca Filbey with us tonight. Jennifer's going to be introducing some more particulars about her. But first of all, I just wanted to remind everyone that the Brain Health Project is one of the main initiatives here at the Center for Brain Health. And we're always looking for people to sign in. You'll see a QR code there on the screen to sign in and be a participant in the Brain Health Project. You'll be pleased to know we have almost 9,000 participants already registered in the Brain Health Project. And we're going to be seeking to add 12,000 new participants every year. So please feel free to go on the brainhealthproject.org and sign up to become a participant and really be part of the brain health revolution. You heard that mentioned in the video, and I love the way Dr. Chapman talks about it. MD Anderson is trying to make cancer history. Through the Brain Health Project and other initiatives we're working on and the wonderful research our researchers like Dr. Filbey are doing, we're trying to make brain health the future. Right? So we want cancer history to be history. We want brain health to be our future, and we think it is. So With that, again, thank you for joining us tonight. We're honored to have Dr. Filbey with us, and I'll turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we are super, super excited and proud to have Dr. Francesca Filbey with us tonight. She's part of the Center for Brain Health family. She is a world-renowned expert in the brain mechanisms of addictive disorders with the aim of identifying both prevention and intervention targets. And she utilizes neuroimaging and genetics to look at addiction across the lifespan. She is a professor in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. She is an associate provost at UT Dallas. She holds the Burt Moore Endowed Chair in Brain Health. She's the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory of Addictive Disorders at the Center for Brain Health. She's an author. Her book, The Neuroscience of Addiction, you can order it from Amazon, but we're also going to be giving away some of those tonight. And not only is she clearly accomplished professionally, but a really fun fact about Francesca is that she's also a wave surfer. So we are excited, Francesca, to have you tonight to talk about the reward motivation loop, what addiction teaches us about the brain. You can take it away.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining me this evening. I'm absolutely honored to spend the evening with you to go over my research, which is exciting to me because I always enjoy learning more about the brain. But in the most recent years, we've really been able to learn more about the brain through neuroimaging techniques. So I hope that you'll learn something tonight from my talk. So the title of my talk is The Reward Motivation Loop, What Addiction Teaches Us About the Brain. And so what I'm going to do is tell you about my research in addiction and how that's helped us understand how our brain responds to rewards, things that we find rewarding. And there's lots of them. I'm sure you can think of a few right off the top of your head. I think immediately chocolate, certain activities like sleeping. So when you think about it, you can see how without these rewarding or pleasurable responses in our brain, then we wouldn't do these things that help us survive. We wouldn't eat, we wouldn't seek companionship. And so in short, finding these things rewarding and having the motivation to seek them out is essential for our survival. So what exactly do we know about how our brain responds to rewards? Much of what we know has come from the study of addiction. First of all, what do I mean when I say addiction? When I say addiction, I'm referring to substance use disorder, which is a compulsive use of substances despite negative consequences. It is a chronic disease that's incredibly difficult to control. Now, keep in mind that not everyone who abuses substances will go on to develop an addiction. Those who develop an addiction do so after recurrent use of substances like alcohol and drugs, which can then clinically lead to significant impairments like heightened urge to use, like in this figure here, difficulty with having to spend more time and using more of the substance than originally intended, neglecting responsibilities at home or at work, and using the substance despite problems in all aspects of their lives, including posing significant physical danger. If there was anything that I want you to take home from today's talk, it's that addiction is a disease of the brain. What that means is that it's a disease that leads to changes in the neurochemistry of the brain, first and foremost, and that leads to other types of changes in the brain like structure and function. So how do we know about these chemical changes? How do we know, in short, that addiction is a brain disease? We know this because studies have shown that substances with high abuse potential disrupt the normal activities of the brain. What you're seeing here on this slide is an example of what cocaine does to these processes in the brain. So if you can see these white images, that's illustrating cocaine. Cocaine, when introduced to the brain, targets receptors or these structures in the brain called dopamine transporters. I don't know if you're able to see that. I don't know if my cursor is there, but great. So in a natural process, dopamine transporters are actually what you might think of as the cleanup mechanism. They are there to, in normal circumstances, be a safety or regulatory control so that chemicals don't linger in the spaces in the brain. So again, in normal circumstances, brain cells like the blue image here and the purple image here communicate with each other through electrical signals or neurochemical signals. What you're seeing here in orange illustrates dopamine. So cocaine, so what these brain cells do when they communicate to each other is trigger the release of these chemical messengers like dopamine, which then influence neighboring cells once they are released. And like I said, these dopamine transporter work to clean out any excess neurochemicals that linger in the brain. And in doing so, ensuring that there's always some regulatory control so dopamine isn't continuously exerting effects on the brain. However, when cocaine is introduced into the brain, cocaine locks onto those dopamine transporters, and so preventing that reuptake or the cleanup of dopamine. And so what happens then when cocaine is present into the system, dopamine lingers in the space and exerts greater and longer lasting effects onto the neighboring cells. And it effectively allows dopamine to hang around there until other regulatory functions kick in. And so what happens when this natural state is disrupted by substances like cocaine? What happens is that a cascade of other events occur, such as interference with other regulatory systems across different neurochemicals. And you might be familiar with some of these neurochemicals down here, but this is just some of the examples of the different neurochemicals that these cascade of events impact, such as adrenaline, noradrenaline. I already mentioned dopamine, but serotonin, GABA, etc. And these neurochemicals are important for a lot of important functions like learning, memory, fight or flight response. And what you're seeing in this slide on the left is that changes in these neurochemicals occur after acute exposure, but following repeated use on the right, you can see that there's continued and increased changes after those use. So this really makes the brain so complicated to understand because, as you can see, following acute use as an example, dopamine is increased. But following chronic use on the right, you can see that dopamine, in an attempt to regulate the excessive amounts in the brain, starts to decrease its natural levels in the brain. So what you may have already observed from the previous slides is that most of these changes occur in these same regions of the brain, sort of in the frontal inferior parts of the brain. And we refer to these regions as mesocortical limbic regions. It's a very complicated term. And so sometimes we refer to it as the brain's reward system. It's called the brain's reward system because these regions are regulated by dopamine, which is the primary neurotransmitter for pleasure and reward. So the reward system is the most primitive system in our brain. It's the oldest, the first to evolve. And as I mentioned, this system is important for signaling things that are important because it ensures our survival by sending reward signals for things that are meant to keep us alive. So these are the things like food, as I mentioned, and companionship. So how do we know all of this? Well, we can thank our colleagues who have studied animals to understand these kinds of behaviors using experiments like what's being illustrated in this slide. They've learned that you can use an experiment like conditioned response to see how animals develop learned behavior to rewards that then change their motivation. And this is called cue elicited conditioning. And so let me just walk you through what this kind of experiment might look like. And in this example, an animal is taught to use a lever in order to obtain a reward, like a food pellet. If the food pellet is only dispensed when a light is on, it will learn to only press the lever when the light is on, or another signal or another cue like sound that comes out of these speakers. And it will continue to do so as long as the food pellet is dispensed when one of those cues is on. So it will learn that paired response called conditioning. So in fact, the animal becomes motivated when that cue is on, and in fact will feel rewarded just because that cue is on, because it's anticipating that food pellet. Interestingly, if something more potent is given to the animal, like cocaine, this behavior becomes very intense. And it, in fact, doesn't get unlearned easily when we deliver a negative stimulus instead, like an electric shock on this grid on the floor. So even though shock is delivered following lever press when cocaine is given as a reward, we see that the animal will continue to press the lever. And so in other words, animals display a behavior similar to what we're seeing in addiction, where they are compelled to perform a behavior despite the negative consequences. So what about humans? You can probably think of some instances, some examples of a conditioned response that you might have that signal reward. For me, it's every time I walk into a movie theater and I smell that buttered popcorn, I see the bright lights, I immediately rush to the front of that line, hand over my wallet for a $50 bucket of popcorn. So in other words, I've become conditioned to those cues for that rewarding experience of having that buttery popcorn. And so for those of you who don't have the same effect, this might also elicit that same kind of response. And we call this craving. What about these, the golden arches? So marketing folks really understand what conditioned cue response is like. So I hope you all have had dinner. So imagine if what it might be like for someone who uses much more potent substances like cocaine, and they use cocaine in a friend's apartment, such as in this scene here. They may then become conditioned to the context of their friend's apartment, or to these objects that they use when they use cocaine. And in fact, behavioral studies have shown us that people who use substances do report these same heightened levels of urge or desire to use substances when they're around these conditioned stimuli or cue, that they become associated with a feeling of intense reward or pleasure. So again, this heightened feeling or urge is what we refer to as craving. So imagine someone who has developed this conditioned response to these what would be benign objects, and how it would be difficult to resist that feeling, because they're always around, always faced with these objects. And speaking of that, I just, excuse me while I move this bucket of popcorn. So the question then for me, as I read through this work, was how do these conditioned cues actually trigger that intense desire or that response, that behavioral response, and what is it in the brain that underlies these mechanisms? And let me tell you why that was important at the time. It was important at the time because for a long time, we didn't really consider addiction as a brain disorder, as a brain disease. And so it wasn't until there was evidence that these behaviors actually had neural underpinnings that people began to understand that it is in fact not a moral failure, but that it is a chronic brain disease like a lot of other disorders that we know. So with the advancements in brain imaging techniques, we've been able to look at the brain's response in real time when these conditioned cues or benign objects are presented to individuals who use substances. So in other words, with these imaging techniques like magnetic resonance imaging, we're able to visualize what it's like to actually crave these highly potent substances. So in these next few slides, I'm going to show you some of the work that we've done in our lab. So again, we use MRI techniques, and this is what you're seeing here. This is an MRI machine. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it basically allows us to visualize the brain. And in addition, we're also not only able to see structure of the brain, but we're also able to see how it functions through changes in blood flow. And so what we did was we leveraged that advancement to see how the brain might respond to highly potent cues. This illustration is an actual picture of someone in one of the studies who participated in the study of alcohol. We wanted to see what a very small taste of alcohol presented to individuals would trigger in the brain. And so in that sense, what we did was we actually piped in while they were being scanned a small amount of their favorite alcoholic beverage. And then we compared it with something just as salient, something sweet that they might also find rewarding. In this other study, we were interested in how tobacco might elicit the same kind of craving response in the brain. And in this slide, what you're seeing is a contraption that we put together called an olfactometer. What it is, in simple terms, is a smell machine. We basically piped in the smell of a person's cigarette into their nostrils while they were being scanned. And in that sense, we're able to see how something as benign as a smell of cigarette might elicit that intense desire or craving. We also, to look at effects of tobacco cues, also presented these small video clips of people using tobacco. Because behavioral studies also said that watching someone else use substances trigger these craving. And then finally, we looked at cannabis, response of cannabis cues in the brain. And how we did that was through tactile simulation. While people were in the scanner, we gave them cannabis paraphernalia. What you're seeing here is a cannabis pipe. It's actually a used cannabis pipe that we were able to obtain from the police department. And so not only was it a real object that people use to smoke cannabis, but it also had still the residue, so you can still smell the cannabis. Okay, so here are the results in one slide for all of those studies. And I put them in one slide because, in effect, what you're seeing is the exact same thing for every single substance, for every single modality. So here you're seeing the brain, and what you're seeing in color are those brain regions with increased blood flow, which we interpret as having greater activation during the periods of exposure to those cues. And so these are the alcohol users when they were given a sip of alcohol. Here are the marijuana users when they are holding and smelling the cannabis. And then here are the tobacco users when they were being shown those video clips, and also when they were smelling those the smoke. And what I failed to add before is that they were given not just those cues for the substances that they use, but they are also being given cues for neutral things that should be rewarding naturally, like food and images of nature. So these activations that you're seeing here show that these reward system response in the brain are greater for these substances compared to natural rewards. And so, as I mentioned before, this is one of the most exciting findings because it has clinical implications. Prior to this work, what we used to diagnose addiction didn't have craving as a symptom. And since then, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders did add craving as an important part of addiction. So what about sugar? We also studied sugar, used the exact same device to deliver the taste to individuals while they are in the scanner. We delivered high caloric drinks like soft drinks and juice and compared it to water. And we found the exact same thing. The brain's response in reward areas, what you're seeing here, was greater in response to those sugary drinks compared to water. So as I mentioned earlier, not everybody who uses substances becomes addicted. So who is at risk? How do we know what our actual vulnerabilities are? First one is genetic predisposition. We know that our brains are, that genes code for how our brains work. As you can see, this is a very busy slide, but just focus on these two metrics here that shows how our cognitive abilities are 40% inherited and brain volume as well. 85% of it is because of our genes. And so naturally, we would look at genes as a potential risk for addiction. And how we did that is that we genotyped individuals who were suffering from addiction and found that, and this is in cannabis users, we found that the greater the number of genes that they had that were mutated or that were considered risk alleles for addiction, the greater the response in reward areas of the brain during the presentation of those cues. We also found that earlier exposure to substances increases the susceptibility to the drug's effects. This is because of the critical neurodevelopment that happens early in life, particularly in childhood and adolescence. So just a reminder that there are dynamic changes going through these critical years that could lead to long-lasting effects. Similarly, early stress, so again, during that period of critical neurodevelopment, increases susceptibility to addiction. In our study, we found that the greater the number of traumatic events that occur early in life, the greater the response and reward regions of the brain during those exposure to rewarding cues. And then finally, having mood disorders such as depression and anxiety can also put one at risk. Our study found that there are greater symptoms of depression, shown here in right, in people who use substances compared to individuals who do not, shown here on the left, for both depression and anxiety. So what can we do with this information? Now that we have learned that repeated substance use leads to conditioned response to cues, and that it has specific neural underpinnings in the dopaminergic reward system, we can evaluate or tailor a current treatment to be more effective by targeting those processes, or develop new interventions that leverage those processes. For example, in one of my studies, in collaboration with a clinician, we evaluated a clinical approach being used currently called motivational interviewing. In motivational interviewing, patients come up with reasons for change. And so what you are seeing here is the response in the brain when a patient doesn't make these response or statements for change, but rather come up with a counter change statement, like I enjoy drinking. This is an actual statement from a participant. And when they produce this counter change language, we could see the same response in reward regions of the brain, shown here in yellow. But when they are asked to produce a motivational change talk, like I want to stay healthy now that I'm getting older, so really trying to increase that motivation to stop their behavior, you can see that it effectively reduces the response in the brain to those rewarding stimuli. So now we are testing if the same pattern of response can be seen across different individuals, different age groups, and also determining how interactions with clinicians might better enhance this treatment response. Now that we have confirmed that it is in fact able to attenuate some of those rewarding response in the brain. So just to summarize what the neuroscience of addiction can do to advance what we know, doing so, performing research in this area could uncover the neurobiological mechanisms underlying these behaviors. It could identify factors that increase susceptibility towards drug effects, and it could evaluate or help us evaluate and improve current interventions. And finally, we are able to develop more targeted treatment with greater precision because of these findings. And with that, I would like to emphasize how this work is only possible because of the engagement of the community. So I want to thank all of you for your interest in this work and joining me this evening and learning more about the research of addiction, and especially to the participants who volunteered for these studies, the funding agencies, the institutions, and my colleagues who contributed to these activities in many ways. In closing, I hope that I've made it clear how we know that addiction is a brain disorder, and that only in treating it as such can we make progress in helping those who need it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was, I think, such a great balance. This is so relevant. And I think I wanted to, first of all, to everybody out there, put your questions into the Q&A. We always end up with more questions than we have time to answer. So our apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, but we're going to try to hit on the most relevant, those that that I think also are kind of repetitive. Francesca, what do you think about, number one, I think that there's a lot of, like you were showing about those with higher depression, anxiety, using more, but so people think that it's a way to self-medicate, but that can also acutely increase these symptoms. So how do we deal with that?
Yes, great question. We are finding that it's sometimes not the cause, but the consequence. Like you said, people do use to self-medicate. And I think that's the area that we're in, is in really understanding that what first of all, the kinds of positive things that we might be able to harness from these substances, but reducing some of the harm. I think that's where the field needs to also focus, so that we are taking advantage of people who do find some relief and do so in a more managed way.
Cool. There was a question just about, in terms of treatment, and I think many people are kind of familiar with the idea of medical intervention, and you were talking about the psychosocial intervention. How do they compare? Are they best utilized together? We know with depression treatments, kind of mood disorders, that there's a combination of talk therapy and meds can be most effective for many.
Yes, that's right. So if there is anything I've learned from all of these studies, it's that treatment should really be individualized. I think that the brain is so complex, and the manifestation of these disorders could be vast. And so I think that all of the underlying mechanisms should be targeted, and so individualized treatment is key. And so yes, I think adjunctive treatments would help some individuals, and might actually be able to get them through, instead of sort of a one-size-fits all approach.
Okay, I have another question, because you were talking about, like, with the mouse, the rat, even with a negative consequence, it still is not enough to overcome a strong addictive craving. So what about if can you replace a reward?
Yeah, actually, that is one of the commonly used therapies called contingency management. Is trying to replace the reward with something that they might also finally, at the end of therapy, completely remove the effects of the other. So yes, I think that's also some of the thoughts, not just behind contingency management, but these replacement therapies, where you kind of try to utilize a substance that might be less addictive, or use it in a much more controlled approach, and then slowly help that person move away from it.
Okay, so on that same note, then could you end up replacing something and then in turn creating that addiction? I think about people, I remember when I was a kid, I remember a lot of the adults in my life would smoke, and it was like this motion that was so, and so I would see people replace it with eating.
Yep.
Exactly. And then there was also a negative consequence to that.
Exactly. Yes. I think, it's a multi-step approach, and I think the treatment plans usually try to tackle the ones that are creating the most problems first, and then over time, hopefully start to remove more and more things. It's definitely a treatment plan that takes a long time. This is a chronic disease, and it may never be the case that people will be completely free of these symptoms. So I think there has to always be a plan, and a dynamic plan at that, to help people along.
Got it. Here's a question of what cognitive tests do you think can help identify adolescent substance use? Is it attention and memory? What are some of the good indicators?
Yes, the best indicators so far, the ones I've shown, genetic predisposition, if they use early in life, that could lead to much more difficulty abstaining, stress, early childhood stress. I'm not talking about stress from homework or things like that. These are traumatic events. And so if those are the kinds of things that are happening to someone, I think their caregivers should be at heightened alertness to these potential risks. Other things are also peer use in adolescence. That is something that has found to also increase the likelihood of someone taking part in these behaviors.
Hey, Jen, can I ask a quick question to go along that score, Francesca? And again, I'm the non-scientist, so I'll ask this maybe more bluntly, but when I think of these early childhood traumatic events that can make someone more predisposed to addictive behavior, I would say, okay, so is there something we can do if we recognize that, instead of just being alert and worrying that that's going to happen, proactively, given how resilient we know the brain is and how responsive we know the brain is to other stimuli, what interventions are available to either make you less predisposed or build some resilience to that maybe otherwise predisposed addictive outcome?
Yes, absolutely. Although I am not, my research is not directly involved in that. What we have found, or what the literature has found, is that that individuals, these adolescents, should be in environments that are supportive. That seems to be the biggest mitigating factor. In a supportive environment that protects them from these high-risk environments, one that allows them to have social activities that where they can interact in positive ways with other peers. Those seem to be the most replicated findings. So it seems to go with any other types of risky behavior, where the more supportive, or the more positive the environment, the more positive the outcome. So just, yes.
Yeah, so Jen, as I'm thinking about what Francesca's saying, I think about some of our early findings in terms of those stronger social networks on overall brain health. So it sounds like overall brain health, Francesca, is going to help these youngsters be more resilient.
That's right.
In the long run.
Yes, that's right.
Well, and that goes to kind of another question that we had, which was, how can the research be used to better address problems that are associated with arrest, incarceration?
Yeah.
I mean, what would you say to that, Francesca?
Yeah, so that is a tricky question, because that already puts someone at a disadvantage. I think that there needs to be structured programs to provide the support, the much needed support for those kinds of individuals. I think that oftentimes those are that's the vulnerable population left sort of to try and find their way or navigate themselves out of these difficulties. So I think we just need to find or improve the current system so that they are supported and rehabilitated.
Cool. A couple questions, like neuro kinds of things are, one is, do all cravings affect the brain in the same way, even if there's not like an underlying addiction?
Yes, that's what we found in terms of the reward system. The reward system is the reward system. There's a final common pathway where all substances that we find rewarding, anything that we find rewarding, and in fact, lots of behaviors are rewarding, like I think people are familiar that gambling has been found to be rewarding for people, and internet, social media. I think there was also someone who has studied shopping, but even these behaviors also elicit the same kind of response in that final common pathway, which is the dopamine reward system of the brain. It's like I said, the oldest system, because that's what's needed to keep us going, to keep us alive. And so that's the system that underlies all of these behaviors, learned behaviors.
Does the brain ever recognize these things as, like, instead of going for reward, it's a threat?
So there are parts of the brain that respond to the negative or to harmful things, and that is a different network, although it interacts with the dopaminergic reward system. It's the network important for emotion and fear, but ultimately it all converges in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain, in the front of our brain that's important for decision making. And so, yes, our motivation to seek reward learned through the reward system could also be motivation to avoid harm that is driven by these fear and emotion regions of the brain.
So this is a big question. Lots of controversy on this. Is just, what do you think about the narrative that cannabis use doesn't have any major effects on brain health?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that question, because most of my funding from NIH is actually to look at the effects of cannabis on the brain. And in fact, it was one of our earliest works that found that the craving response for cannabis is just as intense as other substances of abuse. I think that much like other substances of abuse and other addictive behaviors, there are people who are vulnerable to the effects of cannabis. So I think it's important to recognize that there are risks to cannabis, much like any other substance out there, and just making sure that we know who those individuals are could help with better informed decisions.
Were you going to ask?
Francesca, let me ask just to follow up on that question. Is there a difference there between, since you talked about early use of maybe addictive substances or early addictive behaviors, do you see a difference in those findings with younger folks as opposed to maybe folks in their 40s in terms of the impact of cannabis use and its potential to become addictive?
Yeah, well, that understanding, or that knowledge, is still developing, because while we do know that adolescents are at heightened risk towards these effects, we also do know that there's a period where the population somehow on their own just stops using without any, there's a decline in number of users, and we don't really know yet what that's because of. So that's usually when people have to have a job or have to support a family, or it might just be coinciding with life directions or trajectories. Or there could really be a neurobiological basis where the brain is no longer as impacted. So I think we are still trying to understand what it is, in fact, that's driving that phenomenon.
Okay, here's another one. It's kind of multi-question tiered. Like, for some addictions, there's some suggestion that total abstention from the substance is, or just like completely limiting that amount, you can achieve that. So do your imaging findings suggest that total abstention is needed?
We haven't done work that would completely address that question, but I imagine it would, because what we're seeing is that the response in the brain is correlated with amounts of use. And so I imagine that that if we continue to see that relationship, that would in fact be ultimately a way to change the response in the brain.
And what about recovered addicts? Like, do their brains react in the same way as they did before? Or what happens with them?
Well, we have hot off the press data on that actually, because we are looking at individuals who are currently using, who are former users, so those who have had long-term abstinence, and then non-users. They still fall in the middle in terms of changes in the response to rewards. So they're not like the current users who are showing these heightened response to cues, and they're not like controls who have very minimal response. And so even though they no longer actively use and probably do not have the intense craving as they used to, their brains do still show some response, which really underscores the chronicity of the disorder. And so hopefully with if everything is well managed, that brain response will just remain a brain response, and they are able to utilize other mechanisms to never suffer from addiction again.
Okay, COVID era, pandemic, quarantine, even as we emerge, still a lot of social isolation. What have we seen in terms of, especially maybe in teenagers, but maybe in young adults, who has the increases, decreases? What are those trends that we've been seeing over the last year and a half with addiction?
Yes. So some of you may have seen the article from the Washington Post or the Dallas Morning News that was from a large study. It's a survey that is conducted every year. So we can see patterns or trends on drug use here in the US. And what they found during the pandemic was a decrease in binge drinking in college aged individuals and an increase in marijuana use. I think that we need to be careful in jumping to conclusions there and misinterpreting the data. Binge drinking is usually a social activity. And so with quarantine, no one was gathering. There was no opportunity to binge drink if you were a college student, especially because the dorms or the universities were not even allowing you to be on site or on campus. And so it's likely that that's why there's that reduction in binge drinking. But cannabis use has steadily increased throughout the years. And so I think that it's just continued that normal pattern. So I don't think that one necessarily is associated with the other. And that escalated prevalence in cannabis use could just be related to the changes in legislation in the US. So that's I think a pattern that we'll continue to see regardless of the pandemic. We'll continue to see that next year as well, I imagine.
Francesca, one other thought I was thinking about is, I know we're focused on trying to also improve brain health in those underprivileged communities. And are you seeing, knowing that addiction, and I don't want to understate this, addiction is an equal opportunity destroyer, right? If it becomes, but are we seeing a higher susceptibility across those kinds of demographics?
Yes, a higher susceptibility for some of the reasons I already mentioned, the stressful environment. And in fact, another factor that has become much more has become highlighted just in these last few years is social inequality, just access to resources. It's likely that even though the rates are the same across populations, across settings, just the access to support systems, to these different programs is just not available.
And I would assume that goes to where you're talking about those intervention measures that would come into play to get people back on track. That's
right.
If they get off track, they have a harder time getting back on track.
Exactly.
Francesca, what are some burning questions in your field that you aim to answer? What do you want to see come?
Well, you've already asked me some of them, which is the age. How is it different across the lifespan? We definitely know it is, because the brain changes with age. And so we are attempting to answer that question. And the abstinence question, what does it mean to be a previous user now that that you haven't used in a while? What kinds of things should you be mindful of? And then I'm really interested in intervention, just making sure that not only do we understand how these interventions work, because like most treatments, it's sort of a hit or miss. And then by the time you've gone through a number of hits or misses, it's gotten more severe, or the picture has become even more complex. And so we want to not only have better interventions, but be able to do so as early as possible.
I'm gonna say this outright, and I could be totally out of school here. Jen and Francesca, you'll have to tell me, since y'all are the smart ones in the room. But it seems to me, when I think about the BrainHealth Project, right, which is this new platform and a new way to collect evidence and a new way to reach more participants, what you just said struck a note with me. I wonder if an intervention as straightforward as our SMART training would give someone enough tools and enough strategies. Let's say they were a former user and had an addiction, have been not using for some time. We could literally use this platform, and that's the beauty. I'm talking to the audience now. The beauty of our platform is, with all the data sets and the access to now thousands of participants and thousands more to come, there's a quick way to get data even remotely on some of these questions that where we see maybe an intervention like that can really help someone from falling back who's abstained for a while. So Jen, it's maybe something we could talk to Francesca about offline, but audience, I want you to know the BrainHealth Project is transforming how brain health research is done, just because of the easier access to populations across not only the country and the state, but the globe. So we are a not-for-profit. I'm gonna let Jen thank you here and thank Francesca, but I want to remind everyone, we are a nonprofit, right? So we put on these programs like tonight. I know I have notes all over my paper on just from tonight, and Francesca's right across the walkway from me, and I learned so much tonight. So we're glad you took advantage of this with us. Please help support us. If you're interested in joining the project, do so and bring someone with you. Bring a partner with you so you can hold each other accountable and do it together. And please, if you have the wherewithal to do it, we also need your financial support if you're able to give it. So I'm gonna be quiet now, but Jen and Francesca, and especially Francesca, thank you so much for tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. Thank you so much. If there was one I think that sometimes there's the idea of addictions, the idea of, again, just in these days right now with social isolation, social addiction to social media and all these kinds of things. And I think people think very strongly, I love how you talked about, like, there's good addiction, like to food, which keeps us alive for survival purposes. But I think traditionally we think about addiction being a negative. Obviously, it's very destructive. What is like the one piece of hope that you see, or something that's a real positive impact that you see out of all of this work?
Yeah. Some of the positives is that we are much more open to really realizing that we can harness some of the benefits of these substances, and doing so while minimizing the potential negative effects. And that's what excites me, is because, using cannabis as an example, we can actually look at all of the different chemical compositions in cannabis. It has 300 different types of chemicals and compounds, and we're just really starting to learn how they contribute and what the interactions are. And I think that's what's exciting to me, is just the boundless possibilities where we could really harness, like I've said already, the potential benefits that we're seeing in people who need it, like people with epilepsy or people with MS. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think, Francesca, this is really the epitome. Citizen science is really about making science accessible to people and making it understandable and relatable, but actionable too. And I think your work is certainly extremely relevant and important across the lifespan, but also I really appreciate your ability to translate this very kind of complex reward system and the good and the bad about these things. And so I hope that everyone tonight has walked away with a piece. Remember, with a good nugget, at least one nugget, and remember about, go check out Francesca's book, but there's going to be several of you tonight that are going to be, that will be receiving the book, Francesca's book. And so we are super happy and thrilled that all of you were able to join us. Francesca, thank you for a really exciting and really provocative, really thought-provoking. There were so many questions. So I just want to apologize for everyone whose questions we didn't get to, but it's hot. It's a hot topic and people are definitely wanting to know. So thank you all. And I hope everyone has a really good Thursday night.
Thanks.
Thanks, Francesca. Thanks, everybody.